Welcome back to the book of Romans. Again, I'm your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson. We're going to continue right where we left off in our last video in Romans chapter 3, verse 27. After Paul's declaration of the core of his gospel in verses 21 through 26, beginning in verse 27, Paul begins what we call an interlocution or diatribe, where he's cross-examining himself with almost like an imaginary, what scholars call an interlocutor, where there's an imaginary person that's asking Paul questions, the tough questions that Paul needs to be able to answer. So he allows a question and then he immediately answers it. So he begins with, "Where is boasting then?" It is excluded. Right? Plain and simple. Where is boasting? It's excluded. Why? Because justification is only by faith. It's the anti-work. I can't earn it myself. I can't do something that would earn my salvation. It's only through faith in Christ. By what law? Of works? No, but the law of faith. This again, we've talked about this already. Paul uses different ways of using the word law here. Beginning with by what law, he's I think using a general way there. The law of Moses, the law of causality. What law is he talking about? By what law? Is it by the law of works, i.e. the Old Testament, i.e. the law of Moses? No, but the law, or the term principle of faith. Only by faith. Notice Paul always contrasts works and faith. Paul never sees faith itself as a work. And we need to always keep those two in contrast with one another. Paul never sees the word faith, or the concept of faith, as itself a work. So of works, no, by faith. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. And here, deeds of the law meaning deeds of the Old Testament Mosaic law, or any kind of good works. Man is justified by faith. It's only faith that is the apparatus that God can use. See chapter 3, verses 21 through 26. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Remember, he talked about there is no difference between Jews and Gentiles. Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. So it has to be apart from the law. It can't be the law of Moses that is the apparatus by which we are saved, or justified, because the law of Moses is only for the Jews. Yes, the Gentiles also, since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. And I do believe that Paul is talking universally here, not just simply universally today, but universally throughout time. That ultimately those who are circumcised, even in the Old Testament, are justified by faith, which he'll get to in chapter 4. But then the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, also through faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. This is a very big contention in the book of Romans as to whether or not Christ ended the law, and he was the end of the law, chapter 10, I believe it's verse 40, somewhere around there, where Paul says that he is the end of the law. Now, is that the end of the law as in the accomplishment of the law, or the end of the law as in the abolishment of the law? And I think there's a clue here in verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish it. By establishing the law, we're establishing the righteousness that is in the law, saying that the law is good because it demonstrates for us the holiness and the righteousness that is required in order to avoid the wrath of God. And so faith establishes the law. It does not contradict it. That brings us then to chapter 4, verse 1. What then shall we say, that Abraham our father was found according to the flesh? Right? Was Abraham found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. So if Abraham was justified by his works, i.e. circumcision or his works of sacrifice, going up to sacrifice Isaac, if he might have something to boast about, but not before God, because even Abraham did not have perfect righteousness. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. That's straight from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. It was accounted to him as righteousness. Notice, again, all the way back to the book of Genesis, the interplay between faith and righteousness is all the way back, Genesis chapter 15. You kind of wonder, God must have had this all as a plan from the beginning. For what does the scriptures? Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him as righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. So the one who works the works of the righteousness, that's not grace. If you're counting on your works, that's not grace that God is giving you. Instead, that's counting as it were toward debt. Why? Because my righteousness is always as filthy rags. That's an important, is a really, really, really important distinction to make. Mankind, because of our depravity, even our good works are filthy rags. Our good works don't amount to a hill of beans good for us. We cannot earn our way toward heaven. Instead, every good work we do is self-righteousness. That's why faith has to be the apparatus to use here. So Paul is saying that Abraham, if he was boasting according to his flesh of the things that he had done, that accounts as debt for him, not grace. Because grace can only work if it's by faith. Because if it's by works, it's not by grace. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted to him as righteousness. Notice here again, he brings it forward to us, but to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies. That's it. I don't work for my salvation at all. I can simply trust or have confident trust in the one who accomplished righteousness on my behalf, who justifies the ungodly, who declares the ungodly to be righteous. His faith is accounted to him as righteousness, just as David also describes. So David also attests to this, describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness. The word impute here, this is so important. The word impute here, it means to think of as belonging to someone else. So if something belonged to you and you imputed it to me, it doesn't mean that I actually even necessarily take possession of it. It just simply means that you start to think of it as belonging to me. It's imputed to me. It's now declared to be mine. Right? So just righteousness here that's imputed to me is thought to be mine and declared to be mine. That doesn't mean that I necessarily possess it and am using it. That we'll get to in chapter 6 and 7. But David says here, this is, by the way, a quote from Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2. This is the psalm in reaction to God's forgiveness of David after his sin with Bathsheba. Psalm 51 is his confession. Many scholars believe Psalm 32 then is his joyous declaration of his blessedness because God has forgiven him. Verses 7 and 8 of Romans 3, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impute sin. Notice here the quotation, Psalm chapter 32, verses 1 and 2. Even David recognized that ultimately my sin must simply be forgiven. It must be taken away from me by God not imputing that sin to me, but rather what David didn't understand was that sin needed to be imputed to someone else. And we see that, we're going to see that in chapter 5, in chapter 5, verses 12 and beyond to 21, 12 to 21, I think it is, that man's sin would be imputed to Jesus Christ. So that's the great exchange. My sin imputed to Christ, Christ's righteousness imputed to those who believe. We'll finish up through verse 12 here in this video. Does this blessedness then come upon circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? Again, here's that questioning and answering. For we say that faith was accounted to righteousness to Abraham for righteousness. Right? So Abraham, it was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then is it accounted? When he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Well, wait a minute. Genesis 15 is way before Abraham is circumcised in Genesis 17. So not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. So Abraham wasn't even circumcised when he was declared to be righteous by God. Instead, it was only by faith. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, the righteousness might be imputed to them also. So Abraham, the father of all who believe, notice here not physical father, because we're not all descendants of Abraham, but rather spiritual father. In fact, Jesus refers to this in the Gospel of John when he says, "You're not of your father Abraham, you're of your father the devil," a spiritual father, as it were. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised. In other words, the circumcision was not itself what caused him to be justified, but rather it was a seal of, or a memorial to his the declaration of his righteousness, which was by faith. Now, verse 12, and the father of circumcision to those who not are only are of the circumcision, but also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had, while still uncircumcised. This is a part of Paul's larger argument here that the gospel is apart from the law. It's apart from circumcision. It's apart from the traditions of the Old Testament, that faith in Jesus Christ is equal to the Jew and to the Greek. That's Paul's ultimate point here. We'll get into the rest of chapter 4 in the next video.